an excellent decision in deciding to be the 2N. I cannot commend you enough. The mere fact that you are at this elective proves you are a better person than you otherwise would be. I want to start by talking about what I love about the 2N, which I also think encompasses a lot of things that are very difficult about being the 2N. First of all, most importantly, you have to put up with 2As who are just prima donnas, just always complaining, need to have the whole debate figured out in advance, need to know exactly what the debate's going to be about. If you dare do anything with fiat, they're going to complain about it. It is absolutely the worst. 2Ns are all about results. We're about making things happen. You also, as the 2N, give all of the hardest speeches. So the 2NR is the hardest speech in debate, and it is like not remotely close. And we'll talk about some specific things about the 2NR kind of later on in this elective. But I, cannot emphasize enough, 2NR is the hardest speech in debate. You also give the 1AR, and you give the 2NC, all the hardest speeches. 2As basically give no real speeches. We all know this. You also have to be an expert on many different issues. So rather than specializing in your particular niche of the topic, you have to know a fair amount about broad strokes and all of the different areas of the topic. And that's a challenge. And I think it requires bigger time investment, more work. 1AC Cross-X is harder than the 2AR. Zach learned that from Klarman and me. That is a fact, not an opinion. The 2AR is the easiest speech, and it is also not close. The whole debate's already happened. What could be easier? You just say the thing that you're winning, and then you're done. Prep time, on the other hand, is something that we as 2Ns get. The prep time is all yours. On the negative, no 1NR that knows what's good for them is going to take any prep time, which means that you get to decide how and when it is allocated. You also get some on the AF, so more or less we are in control of how prep time is allocated. I mean, on a slightly more serious note, I think preparation and research are really, really, really rewarded as a 2N. That if you have done the work and you've done some reading and cut the cards, you're going to be in a good spot. We're going to talk about kind of how to allocate that in this elective. The fact that you play such an important role in both the AF and the neg, I think, is really nice. So, the 1AR is a crucial speech for the affirmative. Obviously, all the speeches that you give on the negative are central. And finally, you control your own destiny. So it is the AF's job to tell you what not to do or tell you that you can't do something. It is up to you to call the shots in the debate, do what you want to do, and it is up to the AF to tell you that you can't. So you control your own destiny. So the way I have this elective broken down, I want to talk about kind of preparing for the year as the 2N, continued preparation during the year, and then just kind of the process of like before debates, during debates, and after debates. What should you kind of be up to? What should you be thinking about? How do you structure your approach to debate as the 2N? So before the year starts, kind of preparing like a champion. Many of you are very likely familiar with this resource, but something that I think is a really important thing to do kind of as soon as camp ends is to compile evidence from all of the camps. And so I'm going to put the link into the chat to where you will do this. It's not updated yet, but eventually all camp evidence will be posted to the Open Evidence Project, which is at that link. And that means, every file, every camp. So, obviously you benefit from being here. You've put the work into these files. Eventually you will get these files, but also everyone else's files are available too, which is a really nice thing to be able to take advantage of. And I strongly recommend doing that. So the first step post-camp is to compile evidence from across the camps on every issue. So you want to produce your own files that take the best evidence from each of these distinct camp files. So that means going through, what are all the generic negative arguments that I could plausibly be interested in running? Here are, I'm going to get, the Michigan version and obviously our version and the version at Cal, and every camp, puts out some version of a lot of the same files. You want to go through and create a master file that incorporates the best evidence from each of those. And so this is, a time-consuming process, but I think it is well worth it for a few reasons. One is that it gives you a good sense of what is out there. It can give you some good ideas for further research, and it is just like a an evidentiary base for you to work from that doesn't require you to start from scratch on every area of the topic. And so, recutting evidence from those files, I think, is worthwhile and recommended, but is not purely necessary. At a minimum, though, you want to read through the files and identify, like, not every card is going to be good. Not every card is going to be worth having for the year, but some of them will. So you want to figure out, where are the best cards on this? What do they say? I also really strongly recommend re-tagging them as you do this. So even within this camp context, you might notice that other people cut cards, they give them tags. They are often not written in a way that facilitates strong presentation in a debate. So if your tags, everyone in our lab knows that our recommendation for tags is that they start with a short front-loaded summary of the argument, 3 to 5 words to summarize, no link, or this is the counterplan solves because, and then a longer summary that unpacks the argument and gives warrants for that argument. And very, very few cards that you come across that have been cut by other people will already be tagged in a way that is conducive to debating. And so I really recommend retagging these cards as you go. In compiling camp evidence, some of this might be a team effort depending on the size of the team that you're on. You might want to divide this up among people, but the 2Ns have to be the most heavily invested in this file organization and mastery, because the better you know the evidence, the better off you will be. But so I am referring to all generic negative arguments, all T files, and all case negs. I think that this is a really good starting point for figuring out what you want to do against a set of AFs and anticipating what AFs are going to exist. So you have some idea as a baseline heading into the year. Here are the AFs that have been produced over the summer. Here are the popular ones. Here are maybe some fringe AFs that are a little bit, trickier, but could either appear during the year or some version of it could appear. So like the FISA AF that we had at the Georgetown camp, is sort of an example of a smaller AF that has some tricks. It's sort of in the opposite direction and very distinct from other parts of the topic. You want to be prepared for that. You want to be prepared for affirmatives like that. And so compiling all these cards, like I said, it's going to take some time. You might want to divide up your resources if you have them to do it effectively, but it's definitely worth the time investment for setting up a good year. The next step, and kind of part of the compilation process, I think, is mapping out the topic for yourself. So every topic can be kind of divided into constituent categories. This topic makes that particularly easy in the sense that there are obviously 3 topic areas. So there's a sentencing area and a policing area and a forensic science area. Within those categories, you might find additional kind of categorization useful. So are AFs in the direction of kind of more criminal justice control? Do we increase AFs that increase or make greater penalties for some set of crimes versus those that decrease penalties, and there's other ways of kind of splicing out the topic within those categories. You want to think about your approach to each type of affirmative that exists within the topic. Every topic has structural weaknesses. So on any given topic, you go into the year and it's hard to be neg, like one of the overriding lessons of this elective and a lot of time that a lot of us spend talking to students is about how the negative is always, reactionary. You are always a step behind the affirmative if the affirmative has done their job well, but every topic also has weaknesses that you can exploit. So this topic in a broad sense is very big because criminal justice reform is so, poorly defined, could mean anything, like find anything to do with the criminal justice system and change it, and that's probably a criminal justice reform. However, it also has weaknesses. So when we talk about functional limits, when debating topicality, that is a real thing that allows you to place filters on the topic that narrow or influence how you think about things. And so the filters, I think, for this topic starts with the state's counterplan. So can the states do it? A lot of sentencing, a lot of policing really happens at the state level and does not need to happen at the federal level to achieve the kind of to resolve the set of harms that might be identified by an affirmative. And the next, functional limit that I think is useful is the agent of the AF beyond, state versus federal level. Maybe there are reasons for federal involvement depending on what, what the affirmative has figured out about how agencies work and, where there are actual jurisdictional or authority reasons for an AF to be done at the federal level. Does it have to be Congress? And that's coupled with I think that there's very good evidence that the term enact in the resolution is a very precise one that has a very particular meaning, which refers to legislative action, or at least to congressional action, and thus ought not to be a court or an agent action. And I think that is a central functional limit that should allow you to place the filter on any affirmative that you see. Can this be done? Does this AF have a Congress key warrant? So not just the federal government, but a congressional action key warrant. If not, either you've got, a Congress or a court's counterplan or an executive agent counterplan good to go, or you have a T argument that they maybe shouldn't have, picked this AF because it has to go through the courts or agencies. We kind of need to hold on to that for dear life as 2Ns on this topic, because if we let the AF kind of go wild on what the term enact means, it's going to be tough, especially by the end of the year. So hold on to enact for dear life. The next step of the kind of pre-year preparation process, prepare generics of each style of argument with some additional work oriented around AFs that are likely to be popular. Flexibility, I think, is really, really valuable and separates kind of good debaters from the very best, because a flexible debater who can go for any style or any kind of argument can exploit weaknesses and can punish affirmatives that are not prepared, and can when you can identify where an AF does not kind of pass the threshold of a functional limit, like does not beat a negative argument based on that functional limit, you can actually exploit that if you can go for any style of argument. I entirely missed my last functional limit argument or thing that I think is an important filter, which is just the abolition K. I think that a good affirmative on this topic needs to have an angle or a reason that reform is good and necessary, in opposition to we should strive to abolish this, iteration of the criminal justice system and kind of, start anew or build from scratch. So preparing generics of each style of argument, T arguments, I think enact must be Congress is kind of a must-have. I would be fully blocked out on every possible 2AC argument on this and be ready to go for it at the drop of the hat. Substantial is a T argument that, gets mocked, I think, often, which not without reason. Usually it's kind of difficult to pick a numeric or quantitative interpretation of what substantially means and really sell it as being predictable or precise. I do think it's worthwhile, given the evidence on, substantially requires field context to give it meaning. I think it is probably worth preparing some kind of baseline substantial violation for each of the topic areas and be able to go for that for an AF that does not meet that particular, doesn't meet your whatever threshold you've set. And yes, that might be an arbitrary threshold. That might be, one that perhaps does not meet the golden test of predictability. But if you can demonstrate that we have to do, we have to give the neg something, and the AF cannot just be any minor tweak to any possible aspect of the criminal justice system, it's going to help with the rest of your preparation, the rest of your debating. Disads. So I think that this is, you should prepare some disads, obviously. I think this is a really good year to get good and nuanced with politics disads and cut kind of a few different versions of them against different kind of mechanisms and agents. That is for a few reasons. One is that, enact meaning Congress means that you have kind of a built-in, all the AF has to go through Congress. So agenda-based disads, take on particular salience if you can demonstrate that the AF affects the legislative process, which it likely does if we're right about our T argument. It's also an election year, so that's a built-in thing that matters, with a lot of kind of diverse impacts. I think it does help a lot to get, like I said, nuanced and specific with your politics disad. So one of the reasons that we cut the Senate elections disad for this camp is that it is a little bit more specific. It is there's a narrative and a story that evades some of the AF's better answers to 2020 in the abstract. It can be a net benefit to stuff. And I think that, that's only kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the wide variety of political processes that criminal justice reform requires and is involved with, and from which you can generate a lot of, I think, pretty diverse offense. So if you can find a specific scenario for criminal justice reform in one particular state, like maybe that affects a particular congressional race or a governorship race, or even like a local prosecutor's race, like I can imagine all kinds of elections-based dissads and broader politics dissads on this topic, because the other reason that this is a good year to get good at politics is that the main reason that most criminal justice reform proposals have not been enacted is political consequences. And so there's not a good, there's a lot less right on the old DA side than you might wish for, but on the flip side, politics is great, so might as well get good at it, and this is a good year for it. Counterplans is obviously another category that you want to build in your core set of counterplans. I would definitely, have the state's counterplan fully prepared and ready to go for, and both courts and the executive counterplan as agent counterplans. I also think it's useful to add process counterplans to your arsenal. So by process counterplan, we mean any counterplan that competes based on the process of the plan being done, and probably competes in some questionable ways, although the term, again, the word enact may be our savior. If we can demonstrate that a counterplan does not enact something, then we can perhaps demonstrate that it competes. With the state's counterplan, I think it's worth noting that you need to be prepared to fiat and continue to fiat and continue to fiat and can just fiat more. So like the OG, just like states do the plan, will get you a surprising amount of the way against a lot of affirmatives if they haven't thought this out very much. The next step might be, if their angle against a state's counterplan is, a federalism disad, you might need to add to your state's counterplan some cooperative mechanism to resolve that. You might need to fiat devolution of authority, make it a Lopez counterplan. You might need to fiat, if some affirmative teams will be under the mistaken impression that states not having enough resources is a solvency deficit to a state's counterplan. You need to be prepared to fiat out of that. Just repeal balanced budget amendments at the state level, raise money some other way. No kind of resource-based hurdle should be sufficient to get past states, as long as you're prepared with fiat. And then critiques, I think, again, like flexibility is really valuable, and the ability to, some kind of tricky policy Fs. I think, there's a lot of ways to get at things that are smaller and are, have angles on the core generics. But a critique is often your best weapon against those AFs, because the more sort of obscure and smaller and sillier an AF is, the more, the less they're gonna get away with kind of like a big, the AF outweighs any given critique, because they're, the premises upon which that affirmative will be built will be very questionable. And so at a basic level, and I had a whole elective on this, I would want to get good at the abolition critique. I think it is also worth having neoliberalism / security, other kind of core staple generic DAs. For some AFs, you might want to read versions of pessimism. I think that, your own kind of comfort level and willingness to engage very, extreme, some sort of extreme ideological perspectives may influence your willingness to do that. But, a very rigid or strongly ideological / structural critique can be useful against some of the, smaller and more soft left affirmatives that perhaps have a better angle on abolition, but certainly cannot permute structural critique. I would also prepare always TUSFG with kind of particularized ideas about the specific topic. So on this topic, why is it important to debate about criminal justice reform? I think this is more or less a fairly easy sell at this time. We're living through a pretty interesting and unusual moment, and there's a lot of attention on our criminal justice system and a lot of focus on ways to reform it. I think it is a pretty easy sell, or in my view, ought to be an easy sell that the, considering possible actions for the federal government to take in that context is important and matters, and is not something that we should, sidestep or circumvent and only consider like individual perspectives or, what we as people maybe think or can individually do, but rather what the collective ought to do, I think is really relevant. In preparing all of these different arguments, you always need to be thinking about the 2 and R that you're going to be giving and not just the 1 and C. So you always want to think about the story that you're telling and what materials you need to tell that story effectively. So if you're, preparing your generic critiques, you're thinking about your link arguments and what alternative you're going to read and how you explain that alternative. The story is, this is obviously wildly overgeneralized, but the story is that the AF's assumptions are flawed or messed up in some way that perpetuates a broader harm, and that means that the AF is ineffective and should not be a starting point or a, perspective from which we ought to operate. Your story for any given disad has to be about how it is outweighs and turns the case. To use a staple, be thinking about why the disad implicates the affirmative if it is true and is a scarier harm than what the affirmative says. Counterplans, any counterplan that you're thinking about, your story is about how it neutralizes affirmative offense. So in the example of an agent counterplan, what is the affirmative's offense? What are their advantages? What is the reason that their agent is necessary and sufficient to resolve the things that they have identified? And can another agent achieve that same thing? It's like thinking about the story of a counterplan is really about the AF at its core. It's about what is necessary and sufficient to resolve the harms identified by the 1AC. So neutralizing AF offense, I think that your story can also, if it's a process counterplan or something like that, may also be rooted in competition. You want to have your competition, your arguments for why the counterplan competes and ought to compete and ought to be considered theoretically legitimate. That should all be built into your preparation. And then T, obviously, why should the topic be limited in this particular way? May be very easy if your cards are very good, may be harder if your cards are not very good, but there's always a story for why the topic ought to be limited in a particular way. If you can sell that negative limits ought to be prioritized and are more important than whatever the AF's complaints are, that's where we want to be. In thinking about file construction, I would always make sure you have stock 1 and Cs against each type of affirmative and make your templates as specific as possible. So every, at a bare minimum, your file should have 1 and Cs against, generic sentencing, generic policing, generic forensic science. And beyond that, I would try to have 1 and Cs against every AF that exists or that you anticipate to exist. So you want to do as much work for yourself in advance such that when you hear an AF for the first time, you're doing less kind of pulling or, copy and pasting from different files and more thinking about the 2 and R. Writing 2 and C blocks, I think it is one of the most useful tools in your arsenal is a set of good 2 and C blocks. So brainstorm what you think a good 2AC would say on a given position and then write blocks to each of those arguments. This sounds fairly basic, but is a step that a lot of people skip when they're first putting together files or putting together files in a hurry, which is the more work you do in advance, the less you have to do before and during a debate. There's a lot of arguments that the AF is going to make against most of your arguments that is very, very predictable. And so once you have predicted the arguments, you can write blocks and be in good shape. All of your 2 and C blocks should mimic the structure that they would, the form that they would take if you're actually debating. So they start with extension or explanation of relevant 1 and C evidence, indites of the AF argument or the AF evidence. Here's why we win, even if they're right about this, and then additional cards. I think each type of file also looks a little bit different. So I would, a T file for the year, I would want really complete violations for the 1 and C. So, not just kind of a hodgepodge of definition cards, but what does the 1 and C violation look like? 2 and C blocks for each of the most likely counterinterpretations, explanations of the violation, contextual evidence, write blocks for your case lists with your T file. So what AFs does the AFs interpretation make topical? Why are those AFs bad? Should not be allowed in. Also case lists for what does our interpretation allow in. Your case negs should, your case negs, new category, should include complete strategies as well as kind of 1 and C and 2 and C blocks on each advantage. So I would not consider a case neg complete until you had an A, a B, and a C strategy against that affirmative. So know what your possible 2 and Rs could be and make sure that you have the evidence and the blocks to execute those strategies. So you might know, like, okay, I think that this, drug treatment AF or whatever doesn't have a very good answer to states, and just be willing to call it a day. I would not call it a day until you both had all the evidence and blocks necessary to go for states against that AF, including different versions of it, and then also the evidence and blocks necessary to go for your B and C strategies. This is, again, kind of what separates good debaters from great debaters is if the argument that you think you're most likely to want to go for doesn't work out, something goes wrong, there's an unexpected twist, you've thought ahead to what's the B strategy. And then if B doesn't work out, what's C? You want preparation. This is the, the central theme. Preparation will get you a long way. But it has to go further than, well, I've heard this AF before and I have some idea what to say. It has to be, what is the 2 and R, and what is the 2 and R if that doesn't work out, and what is the 2 and R if that doesn't work out. Your critique file, oh, there's a thing. Oh yeah, it's you'll never know, Liam.
It's fixed.
Well, what separates good debaters from great debaters is their headsets working. Your critique files, I would make sure you have kind of specific links to different types of affirmative and alternatives, obviously blocks for answering permutations, blocks for answering the alternative fails, blocks for how the debate should be evaluated. Counterplan files, you need obviously solvency evidence. I think probably the most important consideration or overriding theme for counterplan files on this topic will be competition. So I would make sure that those blocks are really good. Competition and theory for things like agent counterplan, states counterplan, whatever. That's the set of blocks that I'd be most interested in. It's useful for any counterplan that you think you want to go for a fair amount that has any questionable theoretical legitimacy or questionable competition. Those, that is a place where I would really focus. And, a good trick to have is just like this type of debate, or the comparison between X and Y, is a central consideration of criminal justice reform. So debates over agent and who enacts or who does the reforming is a central feature of criminal justice literature and needs to be a part of our debate. Reading cards on competition and theory can go a long way. Your DA files obviously need specific links, and they need, I would, also invest in that case in turns with DAs, invest a lot in turns case cards, especially, a topic like this where the DAs might be a little bit weaker. If you can win that a disad implicates or turns the case, it is at least one step further than, you know, well, we have a dissent that's not very good. Maybe it's not super compelling. If it implicates the case, it can become a lot more compelling. And if it's a net benefit to a counterplan that solves the F, it's even better. Thinking about preparation once the year has started, a few things. One is to create a 1NC toolbox file if you have not already done this. So I would have, if you know that you're going to read X argument, T enact, or a court's counterplan, or an abolition K, have a set of just a file with just 1NCs on the positions that you read the most often that can be quickly assembled. That's especially useful for anytime you're debating a new AF, having kind of having less digging to do into. First, you learn that it's a forensics AF. Now I have to go into my forensic science neg, or my set of forensic science negs rather. Now I have to find this individual section. If you have 1NCs ready to go, that'll be a lot faster. You need to keep your files updated, which sounds like a very obvious point, but is really important. And so you should continually be cutting new cards and writing new blocks and rewriting blocks, which we'll talk a little bit more later on. You want to assign specific tasks to the 1N. So there are certain things when you're approaching a debate on the negative that you don't want to have to think about if at all possible. So I think a really common 1N task is just like pulling impact defense. For some people, maybe it's pulling critique shells or T violations, or for some people, maybe it's just making a list of the impacts that are in the 1AC. Just figure out what you want to kind of have off your plate and have assigned to the 1N and routinize that process so that you don't have to have the conversation every time. That is something that they will automatically do once approaching a 1AC. So, in my grand theory of 2As are the worst, when they are 1Ns, they usually don't know what to do without some prodding. Sorry, I disconnected my external monitor, which is why I suddenly disappeared. So they need to be told what to do. They will be most useful if they are specifically directed. They will often not take initiative because, we all know what they're like. So give them specific tasks. You also want to monitor kind of the wiki, and wherever else you get your intel to figure out and keep on top of what AFs are being read and what is popular, and that'll influence your preparation process. The last kind of general preparation thing for during the year is prepare something new for each tournament. So one of the, in my rhapsodizing about like flexibility being really important, I strongly believe that. I think that debaters who are predictable and go for the same thing every debate are a lot easier to beat, especially, the higher up you go and the better you get. Predictability will always work against you. And so having flexibility is kind of step one in undermining that, and being able to go for anything at the drop of a hat is really useful. The next step is new arguments. So, we've talked about our generics. We've talked about being ready to execute those. But I think that, again, the higher up you go, the better you get, the better people will be at answering those generics. They will have angles, and your best defense against that, in addition to your flexibility to go for each of the possible generics, is to have new ones. So before each tournament, I would kind of pick something new and focus on it. And be ready to go for that in kind of the first situation in which it becomes relevant. So a new process counterplan, critique that you haven't really been going for, like a security K, a T, maybe you decide this tournament is like T substantial. And the goal is not like, well, I'm going to go for this no matter what at like the first possible opportunity, but rather to have, something that is a little bit different from what you've been doing that can elevate and take to the next level your debating and kind of your ability to do different things at different times. Before debates, step one is to work backwards from the 2NR, and I talked about this a little bit before, but you need to know your top 3 strategies in order. So what is my ideal 2NR, what's my second choice, and what's my third choice? And in considering first, second, third choice 2NRs, think about capturing AF offense and exploiting AF weaknesses. So where does the AF have the best offense? What is the kind of core trick of this AF? What is the thing that it is best at? And how can you capture that? You know, what counterplan best neutralizes that? What critique most gets at the central thing that they're talking about? And exploit AF weaknesses. You know, if you've mapped out the topic and know the AFs that are kind of, you know, larger and do more things, make a bigger change, they are more likely to influence the outcome of the election, or they are more likely to, you know, kind of be susceptible to abolition versus reform. Just lots of, you know, anywhere that you thought about kind of the contours of the topic, be prepared to execute in relation to that, and in the context of exploiting weaknesses. The next step, once you've mapped out your 2NRs, your top 2NR strategies, is what block divisions make those 2NRs possible. So not every 2NR is equally good, and not every block will set up a good 2NR on each of those things. So consider what are the viable 2NRs, how many, you know, strategies do you have, and how do you get there? Block division is a trick that, you know, seems really easy or obvious, but I think that there's more to consider than a lot of people realize. So like a lot of people are familiar with or comfortable with politics goes in the 1NR because they have more time to read the evidence and it doesn't get cross-exed. Like, yep, no problem. That's, I think, often a very good strategy. What else beyond that? Well, I think that I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here. Offense in the 1NR is good. The more often you can get something central in the 1NR that is likely to be in the 2NR, the better your block will tend to be, and the better your 2NR will tend to be. The reasons for that are that you get to flow the 1NR in a way that you don't get to flow the 2NC. And so having a good flow of the argument always sets up a better rebuttal, as you all hopefully know. The 1NR, as we know, has the most preparation time, which can influence it being the best speech. There's, as we discussed, no additional cross-ex, and someone in the debate, the 1N, will have read every affirmative card on that position. So, you know, the 2NC, you often don't have time to read every F card. You have time to, you know, process their best cards, their most important cards, but often not every single one. The 1N has no such excuse and should have read every F card, which means that there's no surprises. The F will have nothing, have not said anything that you haven't thoroughly considered and processed. So have something in the 1NR that's likely to be in the 2NR. And, you know, a likely objection would be, but 1Ns are the worst. I agree with you. If you have written good blocks, they will have a basis for a good speech, and then all they have to do is execute with those blocks and be able to like read some cards and make some evidence in tights. So you have made the job very easy and have benefited yourself in the process. Make sure, yes, we're still talking about prior to debates. So block division, have that mapped out in advance. Again, kind of different possible iterations of what the block might look like. I would never lock yourself into, we know the block is going to be this, because you want to make adjustments and make decisions based on what the 2AC actually says and what they are better on and worse on. You want to get on the same page with, you know, your friend, your junior partner, the 1NR. I would always make sure that you can cover the case with as much time as possible. So ideal would be like 3 minutes or more. That's for a couple of reasons. It is difficult for the F to kind of dismiss case arguments in the 2AC. They have to answer them. It is also very important to cover the case thoroughly to set up a possible status quo 2NR. So if your coverage of the case is not thorough, a good AF team will know that that makes it much more difficult for the 2NR to be a DA in case. So having, you know, substantial and well-developed arguments against the case make it much more likely that you can go for the status quo in the 2NR. Before debates, you know, when possible, Read through 1AC evidence and prepare cross-ex questions. This is one that I think is really important that people do not do nearly enough, is think about your cross-ex questions and your cross-ex strategy in advance. So you want to get something out of 1AC cross-ex and not just be asking kind of aimless questions. And the best way to get something out of 1AC cross-ex is to have thought in advance about what you want to ask and what you want to accomplish. Because the ultimate goal is argue, don't ask, right? That's the basic premise of good cross-ex: argue, don't ask. And you can only really argue if you're prepared. So cross-ex requires preparation as much as everything else. If you've kind of like, met those thresholds, your 1NC is ready to go, you have cross-ex questions ready, I would start writing your 2NC, preparing your 2NC, do specific impact assessment, refining your kind of link and solvency work. I would check your highlighting and your tags for cards. Again, tags, way more important than people think. Like, a tag is how the judge processes the argument the first time that you make it. And so if a tag does not adequately express what the argument is, why it's true, and what the implication of the argument is, they have not fully processed the argument, which means that it is going to be more difficult to sell them on your position later in the debate. So tagging, really think people should consider tagging more. Plus, as I complained about earlier or talked about earlier, tags should be easy to flow. And the best way to do that is to front load it with that 3 to 5 word explanation that summarizes the argument. Obviously, if the AF team has debated before and has stuff on the wiki, you can start reading 2NC blocks specific to their 2AC answers, which is a great position to be in. For any case arguments that you think are relevant and important, most of the prep work can be done before the debate, because it's a question of what arguments do I want to extend, and what additional evidence do I want to read. I think I already said this, but you should definitely have talked through the possible block strategies with the 1N before the debate, just so they know what might be coming, but that ultimate decision about block strategy will not be made until after the 2AC. Thinking about kind of the 1AC through the block, I alluded to this, but ask cross-ex questions of the 1AC with an eye toward your strategies. So if you have a counterplan that, targets one internal link of the affirmative, ask them questions about that internal link, like, why does this matter? Why does this internal link overcome these alternative causes? Or why is it able to resolve your harms? You can hopefully get them to talk about how important that internal link is, which you can reference in cross-ex when saying this counterplan solves this internal link. They have said that this is, the single most important factor. We have that taken care of, bada bing, bada boom. Something that people forget to do sometimes is flow the 1NC and 2AC on all positions. And by forget, I mean just like don't do it. You should flow the 1NC so you know the arguments. You have got to flow the 2AC on everything, even the stuff that the 1NR is going to take, because you need to have a good kind of complete map of the debate. Always take prep time after the 2AC before 2AC cross-ex. So once the 2AC has ended, before that cross-ex starts, that's when you want to take prep to talk to the 1N about the block, like what are we actually going to extend? And that's for a couple of reasons. You want to make sure that your prep during 2AC cross-ex is as maximally useful as possible, and you want to make sure that the 1N is asking questions that'll actually end up being relevant. So if you know you're kicking something and the 1N is asking like 2 minutes of questions about the thing you're kicking, you have just wasted 2 minutes of speech time, because that will never be relevant again. And again, we know the 1Ns, they're prone to go off on their own and do irrelevant, unhelpful things. So you got to guide them. Yes, so as discussed, your block strategy, you probably have a pretty good idea what's in the block, but the 2AC, you should be ready to exploit a 2AC that's bad on something. So never have anything in the 1NC that you cannot extend if it is handled poorly. Very important golden rule: nothing should go in the 1NC unless you can extend it if it is handled poorly. Other things about the block. The 1NR, like, let the 1NR kick stuff. I think that you want to maintain some like mystery in the block, and if the top of the 2NC is just kicking everything you're not going for, that kind of lets the AF know exactly what you're up to, and you don't want them to know until absolutely necessary. So leave some mystery. Block structure. really quickly, just want to cover this, even though I discussed it in writing 2 and C blocks. Answer every 2EC argument in order, extend your 1 and C evidence, indict the F argument. Here's why we win, even if they're right, then more evidence. I think overviews should only be for anything that cannot or will not be covered on the line by line, or anything that frames how the judge should evaluate the flow as a kind of full in entirety. So, overviews that just like explain the argument, get rid of them, don't do it. On case, select which arguments, you are the best, extend those, read more evidence. The big overriding thing, read more cards. The big benefit of the block is to read additional evidence and build in, tricks and layers and nuance. So giving case lists on topicality and reading turns case cards and giving, like I said, reading cards on competition are all things that are really hard for 1ARs to deal with because they're examples of sort of minutia. So, a case list is like a detail that informs your argument. On a topicality argument, I'm talking about, a case list that is like, here's some stuff that the AF makes topical that really sucks, and our set of cases that is topical under our interpretation. It's really hard for the 1AR to have the time to deal with that in addition to everything else, and that means that you set yourself up for a better 2NR. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, the exception for overviews is anything that wasn't answered. It's like, here's what they've dropped, they messed this up. And then anything that frames how the judge should evaluate every other argument on the flow. I would pay very, very close attention to the themes and questions of cross-ex of the 2NC. So 2As are silly and they are not the brightest bulbs, and they love to give away the 2AR in the cross-ex of the 2NC. The questions that are asked in cross-ex of the 2NC will almost always be the things that they go for in the 2AR. So if their questions are about competition, it means they want to go for the perm. If their questions are about the alternative to a critique, it means that they want to go for the alternative sucks. If their questions are about, your answers to any given set of arguments, that's likely the thing that they want to go for. A really basic thing that you probably already know, but just in case, if a question is ever about something that you dropped or didn't answer, you still get another speech, give it to the 1NR to answer. Again, 2A is just like, don't know what they're doing, and will often just be like, I think you dropped something. And you'll be like, great, the 1N's going to answer it. You forgot how the block works. Yeah, and if the 2A in any other way gets overzealous, so like if they're really pounding on like your uniqueness evidence and it reveals that there's some 2AC warrant that was not answered by your uniqueness evidence, like again, the 1NR gets a speech, have the 1NR read cards on this. So pay close attention to that cross-ex and let it influence the rest of your block when you drop. Yes, that is difficult. Don't drop conditionality is definitely another 2N, important 2N tip. Yeah, minutia that screws with the 1AR. So case list on topicality were one. There's obviously like myriad examples on critiques. Turns case, solves case, root cause, results in the AF, whatever. Counterplans, results in the AF, follow on, and things like that as another are all examples for counterplans. Competition, your competition blocks, if the AF best argument is a permutation, you should read like several different cards on competition. So one should be like, here's some definitions that establish our competition argument, and then another card should be like, here's a card about why this is really important to debate about. And so if you extend your perm and like answer all our definitions but don't answer this is something that should be debated about, you've given us a reason that this should be competitive that you haven't answered. Disadds, obviously, turns case. I would always throw in like a link turns to the case argument wherever possible. Other like case arguments, you can sometimes sneak in a little bit of offense where they're not expecting it, just like drop in a random link turn. The case lists on T thing I think really matters, as does like a topical version of the affirmative. If you ever make a topical version of the affirmative argument on T, you should always build in a reason that the topical version doesn't solve your offense. But it is another example of like something that's really hard for the 1AR to deal with. Also theory issue or theory arguments on permutations and stuff like that, like multiple permutations bad. Like, I don't care. Say lots of stupid stuff. If it takes 1 AR time to answer it, great. Oh, kick things. Say another example, kicking arguments and getting something out of it. So if you kick a disad, get something out of it. So, you know, concede a defensive argument to kick a disad, you know how to do that. Explain why the defensive argument that they've made takes out the affirmative in some way or implicates solvency in some way. This should be a real argument and not something that they can just blow off. But forcing the 1 AR to go back to a page that you have kicked is like free time for you. Epic indeed. The 2&R, I think that a lot of the 2&R is shaped by the things that come before it. So research preparation and block execution are all so important for giving a good 2&R. It's the hardest speech and debate. It has to be efficient like the 1AR and persuasive like the 2AR. And my most important thing, overriding thing for the 2&R is to anticipate and neutralize the 2AR. So you need to think before the 2&R, how could the AF win this debate, and then beat that argument or beat that version of the argument. So, you know, again, this is another like separates competent or decent debaters from great debaters. You know, a 1AR that kind of like bumbles through and like has some stuff to say, they like read a couple cards, they're like doing all right. It's easy to feel really comfortable going into that 2&R if you're like, these arguments are not very good. I set up some tricks. I'm in good shape. But the great 2&R will beat the better version of that argument that is going to happen in the 2AR. So again, we know that 2As are liars and cheats, and they are going to pretend that the 1AR was a lot better than it was. And so you want to beat the 2AR version of this argument, not just the 1AR version. And so anticipate and neutralize the ways in which the affirmative is going to, make things up. In sort of making your 2&R choice, you got to assess, it's a balancing act between your best argument and 1AR weaknesses. So again, easy to fall into the trap of like the 1AR only made one argument on this flow. I'm going to go for that. If the one argument is something that is like true, that their cards are better on, that, you know, is just a lot more comparatively threatening than their arguments on something else, that's a tough choice to make. You only have the one argument to beat, but it's maybe more true. So be able to balance those things. And again, if you're beating the best possible version of the 2AR, this choice should be easy. So if you know they've extended one argument or two arguments on this flow, I know how we beat these arguments, even if they are done better, you know, easy choice to make. And ideally that lines up with what your best argument was and your A strategy going into the 2&R. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you'll have an A strategy you feel good about, but the 1AR kind of bobbles something else. And you got to be willing to go for the thing that they bobbled while knowing that it might be a risk if it is a little bit weaker than the argument you initially planned on going for. So again, write the ballot. Well, not again, but next thing, the first few lines of the 2&R should write the ballot for the judge. So the first few things that you say in the 2&R should be the reasons that you want the judge to say, I voted neg. I voted neg because. So some risk of the disad outweighs a mitigated solvency deficit, or I think the critique, you know, gets at the root cause of the case, or the AF's interpretation is a disaster for limits. Just like whatever the core script is that you want the judge to say for why they voted neg should be the first few lines of the 2&R. And that is worth writing out because you want to sound really good, you want to sound really confident, and that is worth having actually scripted out rather than kind of trying to come up with it on the fly. So your prep time should be devoted in part to getting those first few lines ready. The prep time for the 2&R and the 2&R itself is also a really good time to use the one end. So like their job is done, they should be, you know, doing what you want now. They should be reading through AF evidence and helping you do good evidence comparison. It's okay for the one end to write out some things, but be careful about this because you never sound as good reading someone else's words as you do reading your own. So just kind of like think about that. The order of the 2&R, I know this is basic. People are weirdly into not doing this, but your offense goes first, your disad goes first, you know, your counterplan that solves everything, do that first. That both enables you to write that ballot on the flow where it's relevant and enables the enables you to sound good at the very start and just ensures that you get through your offense before you go to their offense. I just remembered another example of a small thing that's tough for the AF to deal with. Build in reasons the AF doesn't solve on the counter plan. So like, even if we don't win the solvency argument, they don't solve. This is not cost the AF, or this is a reason they don't solve. So on the counter plan, add some like, build in some solvency deficits to the case itself. If they're not extending that solvency argument, they might miss it. So time allocation, you got to spend you obviously have to spend enough time necessary to win your offense and to neutralize theirs. Always spend most time on the AF's best arguments. So some of that is all of this is influenced by the 1AR, but a winning 2AR knows that what their very best arguments are and will make them sound amazing. So your time allocation needs to account not just for what the 1AR did, but for what the 2AR will be. And so the best argument that they're most likely to go for, that you're most likely to lose on, is where you should spend the majority or the bulk of your time on the off case positions that you're going for. Don't go for too much on case. I would pick 1 or 2 arguments. If the case flows end up in the 2NR, don't spread yourself too thin. And always be thinking, how can the AF win the debate and how do I beat that 2AR? That also means recognizing, is theory the AF's best option or they're most likely out? That means spending more time on theory than you might otherwise. After debates are over, I think is an underutilized time. I would immediately write a block to any argument that you did not before that debate have a block to. So your files should be improved by every single debate that you have, every neg debate that you have, because right after the debate, as soon as you get the evidence, obviously, you should write blocks to the arguments that you didn't previously have blocks to. Make a list of ways in which your strategy could be improved. So what worked about your strategy, what didn't work, and what do you still need? Take notes on the decision and ask the judge strategy questions in addition to just technical execution questions. So what did you think about the strategy? What was working, what wasn't working? Whatever you didn't go for, you want to be able to go for the next time. And so ask questions about this. All this kind of contributes to the cycle of preparation that enables you to stay one step ahead of the AF, even though they have all of the built-in advantages. We're just about out of time, so I have to wrap up there. Happy to answer any quick questions, but if nothing else, I hope that you're ready to, take the world by storm and, never listen to a 2A whine ever again. Cheaty stuff you can do with the ablation K. Well, it definitely solves the AF. So I would say it solves the AF better and solves the root causes of the affirmative. I would say it turns the case in as many ways as you can. I would say I would build in some like utopianism good arguments. If they say that the alternative is utopian, I would be like, yeah, that's great. That's the way we should be thinking about the world. Really, any of the K tricks I think are pretty easily adaptable to abolition. Oh, can you speak on 2NC counterplans, whole new ones? Yeah, 2NC counterplans, great. Whole new ones and new planks. I think that 2NC counterplans, again, it's like up to the AF to tell you not to, and AFs are surprisingly bad at articulating the reasons that 2NC counterplans might be considered illegitimate. So the truth of the matter, as we all know, is that AF debate favors the affirmative, and that is because of the structure of debate. And any debate that starts in the block for the first time particularly favors the affirmative, because you only get one more speech to extend an argument, whereas the AF gets 2 more speeches. They get to answer it, and then they get to answer it again. And so 2NC counterplans should be very defensible from that perspective, because it's like, truly, this only helps you. You get to answer it twice, and we only get 1 more speech to defend it. And it's also a no-cost option if there's something that you're not prepared for. So if they read an add-on that you're not prepared for, or an impact turn or whatever, there is no reason not to, I think it's very unlikely that you lose on having read a 2NC counterplan if you don't end up going for it. If you do end up going for it, I still don't think you're all that likely to lose on it being a 2NC counterplan if you're prepared to defend it, which I think is not that difficult given the above. I don't know what the kind of distinction between whole new ones and whole new planks necessarily means in this context, or what about that you're wondering. I think that depending on your approach, it's like it's all the same thing, right? Like you're either adding a plank and you're going to kick it if you don't want to go for it, or you're reading an additional counterplan that you're also going to kick if you don't go for it.
The way I've defined conditionality in rounds when asked like set as a counterplan is that like if I have a very long, like a lot of planks in a counterplan, that the planks aren't conditional, but that the counterplan is. So when I think of adding a new plank in the 2NC, that for some reason seems like a conditional plank to me because it's been added. But does it interact with my condo stuff at all?
I do think that interacts with your interpretation on conditionality. But I also think that interpretation, like I would always just be able to defend what you did.
Yeah.
And so, you know, like maybe you're like, oh, well, the counterplane itself is conditional and the planks are not. Like, I think, you know, that can be a good way of getting yourself out of some answers to conditionality, but not all of them really. It's like at the end of the day, it's either conditional or it's not. And like, there's no particular difference between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. You know what I mean? There's no like actual way in which reading additional planks or additional counterplans becomes that much more, like links that much more to the F's offense. It's all basically the same.
Okay.
Any other questions? Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go 2Ns.